Good evening, students. This evening we'll be talking about the Federalist era, 1789 to 1800, and we'll be talking about the challenges faced by the United States and also the challenges faced by George Washington as the President of the United States. All right, for note taking this evening, what I would like you to do is to please write each one of these terms down, and for each one, summarize them, basically explaining how Washington is dealt with the situation and who was involved, what happened, when it happened, where it happened, and why it happened. We're going to look at the Whiskey Rebellion, his relationships with Native Americans, his relationship with the British, how he dealt with the French Revolution, and lastly, how he dealt with the Spanish. What we want to answer today is what challenges did the United States face during George Washington's administration. Now, if you remember from last night's homework, part of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan for the United States was to place a tax on whiskey. Now, whiskey is an alcohol made out of grain. Most farmers in the west of the United States farmed grain, but bringing that much grain to market was bulky and difficult. So they would make it into whiskey, distill it into liquid, which was much easier to bring to market and much more profitable. Now, in a lot of ways, whiskey became the money of the frontier. It was used as currency. They would trade it for salt, sugar, nails, ammunition, anything that they needed to have in order to basically run their lives out there. However, they did not have actual money. So therefore, they did not have any money to, in fact, pay the taxes with. The whiskey tax to them seemed incredibly unfair, and it seemed essentially like British rule all over again, being taxed and not being asked for what they wanted to be taxed on. So predictably, what happens is the same thing that happened during the Revolution. Farmers refused to pay the taxes, and they rose up in arms and chased away all of the government tax collectors, and so therefore the government couldn't collect. Hamilton decided to convince Washington that troops should be sent in to put down the rebellion to show strong force from the new country. 13,000 soldiers, led by Hamilton and Washington himself, are led into western Pennsylvania. The rebels flee before they fight, and essentially this saves the nation and shows that the government will defend its laws against its own citizens. Now, you may want to look at this and consider it possibly a little hypocritical, considering we just fought a war against tax measures very much like this. Now, another major problem facing Washington was Ohio, believe it or not. Once again, the same issue presented itself. Indians held the land, whites wanted the land, there was still British forces in the land spurring on those Indians. Washington wanted to give himself a buffer between Spain, France, and England, and so he signed treaties with the Native Americans. However, whites ignored the treaties, went and settled in Ohio anyways, and fighting broke out, just like normal. Once again, Washington saw the fighting as a reneging on the treaties, and so therefore he sent in General Arthur St. Clair into the Northwest Territory in order to restore order. In November of 1791, Indian forces, a coalition led by Little Turtle, a chief of the Miami people, and Shawnee Indians and various others, led a coalition fight against St. Clair, where they routed the Americans, killing 600 American soldiers by the Wabash River, the biggest loss of American lives to Native Americans in the history of the United States. Now, at this point, there was talk to ally with France in order to take away power from the Spanish and the British once again and destroy the Native Americans first off. Now, the British took this talk as a threat, and they began to set up forts in the Great Lakes region once again, and they used these forts to urge Native Americans to continue to fight, attack, and destroy white settlers, inciting more violence in the region. Now, the Native American demands were unacceptable to the whites. They wanted all white settlers to leave the Ohio River Valley. Americans believed the Ohio River Valley was theirs, that they took it from the British and they took it from the Native Americans. And so George Washington decides to send in Mad Anthony Wayne and 2,000 other men in order to take out the Miami, take out the Shawnee, and officially destroy the Native American resistance in the Ohio River Valley. General Wayne led his soldiers to the outside of Fort Miami in modern day Ohio, about 2,000 of them, where instead of attacking immediately, he delayed for 3 whole days, waiting for Native Americans to grow weak from their custom of not eating before battle. After 3 days of waiting, Wayne and his men decisively attacked the Native Americans and decisively routed them at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wayne only losing 30 Americans in total during the entire battle. Wayne pursued the Native Americans to Fort Miami, where the British, instead of allowing them to come in the fort, closed the fort's doors in their face, essentially saying that, well, we don't want a war with America. We wanted you to defeat the Americans for us. However, that didn't happen. The Battle of Fallen Timbers crushed the Native American hopes of keeping the Ohio River Valley. The Treaty of Greenville was signed, and essentially this surrendered all the Ohio River Valley finally to American control once and for all. As we know, a relationship with France at this time would have been problematic because the French were undergoing their own very bloody revolution. Now, during the revolution, the French and British ended up going to war. Both sides were gaming for an alliance with the United States. However, Washington decided on a proclamation of neutrality, picking neither side but be remaining friendly to both. Both sides, however, saw this as essentially a declaration of war against them. Although the French would receive aid from the Americans during the war in regards to trade. Now, every action has consequence because the British disliked this idea that Americans would trade with their hated enemy, the French, and they began to seize American sailors and impress them into the British Navy. Now, this doesn't mean flexing for them or showing off their tattoos. This means essentially kidnapping them and forcing them to be part of the British Navy. In order to end this practice, Washington sent John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to Britain to negotiate Jay's treaty. What this would do would have the British leave American soil once and for all and say to them to stop impressing our soldiers. However, we would not give us our sailors back. Now, the last issue that was dealt with during Washington's presidency was a treaty with Spain. Essentially, Spain controlled the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was essential to all Western farmers in order to essentially ship their goods to market, which would come out of the port of New Orleans. Spain feared that the U.S. and Britain would work together against them in North America, and Washington needed to ease these tensions. So he sent Thomas Pinckney to Spain to settle the differences. Pinckney signs a treaty that gave the Americans free navigation rights over the Mississippi River and the right to trade out of the port of New Orleans, essentially giving them access to all of the Mississippi River and access to the Great Lakes, making shipping in the United States much easier. While most historians and most citizens of the United States would say that George Washington's 2 terms in office were a complete success, after these 2 terms, he decided to walk away from the office, setting a precedent that no president should serve more than 2 terms in office. In his farewell address to the office, Washington attacked political parties. He said that we should not be involved with foreign nations, and essentially that he needed to have neutral policies towards all or good faith. He set many precedents as the President of the United States that many would follow, however, many would quickly walk away from, as we will see with our next president. So please, once again, take a second here to refresh and summarize each one of these events in your own words, essentially asking who, what, when, where, how, and why. And please, under those, answer the essential question: what challenges did the United States face during Washington's administration? Thank you very much, and see you in class.